Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and I have the privilege this afternoon of having a good conversation with some fine friends who are absolutely leaders in their own area, which has to do with the future of nuclear reactors in Canada. Angela Bischoff, who is with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. It's an organization that has it in for nuclear power reactors. Is Gordon Edwards, who is with the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. And that's an organization that has existed, 20 more, maybe 30 years. How long has it existed, Gordon?
Well, longer than that, yeah. It started way back in the 1970s.
Well, we have an election coming up in Canada.
Ontario is the province in the country with the most renewable power. And it was the last Liberal government that really invested in moving Ontario to a renewable future. And they were also, they were negotiating with Quebec to import water power from Quebec. They had a feed-in tariff program where they were purchasing wind and solar, and they built out a lot of renewable infrastructure in the province. Now we have a conservative government, and that's shifted. Even the previous government, because of political opposition around the rural countryside, primarily the rural voters in Ontario, they opposed this push for wind and solar. And so the previous government and this government pulled back. And this government, actually, the first thing they did when they got elected was they canceled 758 renewable energy projects that had already been signed by the previous government. So they rolled back the renewable power industry in this province, and it folded up, and a lot of those companies left the province for Alberta and other provinces and other countries, because Ontario just has like no interest in pursuing the renewable power option anymore, unfortunately, because the price of renewable power now around the world has gone down so dramatically, especially water power, but water and wind especially are a fraction of the cost of nuclear power. So Ontario is really in a unique situation because it's locked into these 18 nuclear reactors. We have 3 of the world's largest nuclear stations in the world, and 10 of them are in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area. So we're poised. We're in a good situation right now because they're all old, and we could retire them when they come to the end of their lives, and that was the initial intention when they were built, and move to a renewable future. We could import water power from Quebec. We could roll out wind and solar. We could invest in conservation. The regulatory agency in Ontario claims that we could cost effectively reduce our demand by an additional 32%. We've already reduced it 17%. We could reduce it that much more. And of course, conservation is our lowest cost way to produce electricity. Unfortunately, this government seems really committed to the nuclear industry. It's a very rich lobby. And, the power workers union are involved, the financial institutions, there's just so much money. The province is about to spend, $50+ billion to rebuild the Darlington nuclear station, 4 reactors, rebuild the Bruce nuclear station. They've already rebuilt 2.
55 for the whole shebang, right?
The whole shebang.
And how much per reactor? What will Darlington cost?
Well, Darlington, for example, is 4 reactors, and they claim it's going to be $13 billion. But that's before cost overruns. And we know that every nuclear project in Ontario's history has gone over budget by, on average, 2.5 times. So we're looking at closer to $32 billion just for the Darlington 4 reactors. So that's $8 billion a reactor. Now they're claiming that they're going to do it for $3 billion each, but we know that they always underestimate their costs. They always lie. They do that repeatedly all around the world. So the government is poised to move in that direction. They're already in the process of rebuilding 1 reactor at Darlington. They've already rebuilt 2 reactors at the Bruce Station. They've extended the life of the Pickering nuclear station well beyond its design life. It was designed to last 30 years. It's now 48, and they recently just got a 10-year license extension. So they're pushing for a reinvestment and locking us into very high cost and very dangerous nuclear power for another 5 decades. When the rest of the world is going renewable, prices are nosediving. In fact, we could import water power from Quebec at a third of the price of rebuilding the Darlington nuclear station. We've got the grid. They've got the surplus. They're begging Ontario to make a deal with them because they don't have contracts with the Northeast US, which they intended when they dammed the rivers. They thought they would have a market with the Northeast US, but that hasn't panned out because they don't have transmission lines, and there's opposition to building new transmission lines. We have the transmission lines between Quebec and Ontario. So economically, it makes no sense to be rebuilding all these aging nuclear stations when we have much lower cost renewable options to meeting our electricity needs. Now, civil society is really calling for a move to a renewable future. And that's what the push for a Green New Deal in the United States and Canada is. Civil society, 100 groups signed on to a Green New Deal.
Well, you said civil society. Well, what about the polls? Are there opinion polls about this? And what does the general consensus say?
Overwhelmingly, by a large majority, the most popular electricity choice is water power. And wind and solar come below that, and nuclear power always polls the least popular. So people are rightly skeptical and fearful of nuclear power. I'm polling people all the time, distributing literature. We have beautiful leaflets. We're going after the Ford government, calling on their wasteful use of tax dollars when they're claiming to reduce the budget, etc. People, and I ask people all the time, how many reactors do you think we have? And nobody has any idea. Or I say, we have 18 reactors. It's just people are bowled over. So we've grown up a generation of people without any awareness of the dangers, how much they cost. We've grown up under this propaganda umbrella that's basically just selling it to us as the cheapest, cleanest source of electricity. And now with the advent of climate change, the nuclear industry has found a new propaganda tool, which is, they call it emissions free. And while it is a lower carbon footprint electricity source, it's much higher than renewable power. It's much more expensive. It's much more dangerous.
Much higher in carbon footprint?
It's higher in carbon footprint than renewable energies, than wind, solar.
Well, how?
The whole nuclear fuel chain is from mining to refining to production to building these mega plants to decommissioning to nuclear waste. We don't even know what we're going to do with the nuclear waste. So it's like building a house without building plumbing.
Right.
Right.
Well, okay. Now this is interesting that you say it has lower carbon footprint than
fossil fuels.
Oh no, but I thought you said the renewables.
No, it has higher carbon footprint than renewables, lower than fossil fuels. So the nuclear industry always touts itself.
Okay. Now, no, but can you stop there? Because I'm trying to think of, if it's true that it's, in terms of carbon, that it's worse than renewables.
No. Oh yeah, it's worse than renewables.
It's worse. Well, then why would they get away with saying the opposite? Why are they? Because one of the big, slogans I think that people are using is that this is some sort of a way of reducing greenhouse gas and so on, and do this as a good green measure. Nuclear is good for the planet. Go through that argument for me, because I don't follow that.
When they're actually producing the emissions, they're not producing any CO2, or sorry, when they're producing the electricity, they're not producing CO2.
Right.
They're releasing other emissions, tritiated water vapor, tritium into the lakes, other emissions, but they're low or no carbon emission in the production. But if you look at the entire fuel chain, they are producing emissions all along the chain. So they claim that they're emission free during the production portion of their production. So it's misleading.
Well, it sure is, because I assumed, I think until you said that a minute ago, I believed them, that it was a lower carbon footprint.
Well, another misleading claim is they claim that it's low cost. They claim repeatedly.
Well, I knew better than that, because I've been following the falling price of wind and solar, especially solar. And I certainly know that it's no longer, they can't make that claim anymore, can they? That it's cheaper, because it's the most expensive kind of energy, isn't it?
They make that claim all the time. And, you know, currently we're paying about 8 to 9 cents for nuclear power. But a couple of years ago, we were only paying 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that compared to solar and wind, which were new on the market, we were paying like 40 cents. 80 cents for some solar power. So it was way, way cheaper, but not when you consider the environmental footprint of those nuclear stations, which still are going to have to be decommissioned. We're going to have to isolate the nuclear waste for 1 million years, according to the industry itself. How are we going to do that? What happens when there's accidents? What happens if we have to evacuate Pickering or all of the GTA if there's an accident at one of, like Pickering is one of the world's oldest and largest nuclear stations, sitting in the middle of the GTA. What are we thinking, giving it a license extension way beyond its life and still claiming it's cheap, it's emissions free, it's safe? You know, it's just the nuclear industry's propaganda that's just coming at us all the time. They've been in this province for decades. We've invested billions of dollars. We got subsidies from the federal governments. The federal liberal governments for decades subsidized the nuclear industry. That's how Ontario could afford to build them. Now, under Harper, they pulled out of subsidizing the nuclear industry, and that meant we couldn't build new reactors. We wanted to build new reactors, but when Harper pulled out, we couldn't afford to build them without federal subsidies, and we canceled the new builds, and we turned our attention to rebuilding, because that would be cheaper than building new reactors, and the feds were out of the picture. It's still going to be very expensive, much more expensive than wind, solar, or water power, but the public is still thinking from the old days where it was cheap, where the feds were subsidizing it.
Well, was it ever really cheap? I mean, when you take account of all the things you've just mentioned, how much it costs to dig up the uranium, how much it costs to transport things, how much it costs to build tunnels where you're going to put your waste, etc. Was it ever really cheap?
Especially if you were to consider the external costs, like the health, people who were impacted by that radioactive, those releases all throughout the nuclear fuel chain. Okay,
but now, Ford got elected.
Okay, so
you know, and Ford is presumably the force behind the commitment to nuclear power. Now,
the Liberals were committed to nuclear power. The NDP is not, and the Green Party is not. The Liberals kept it going all those years under the leadership of McGuinty and Wynne. They kept that going. But Wynne was negotiating like in those days when they were negotiating those deals, they negotiated off-ramps. So for example, in the case of Darlington, we own Darlington. It's owned by OPG, the Citizens of Ontario. We can pull out of that deal at any point. And in the case of Bruce, which is privately managed, we have written into those contract off-ramps that after 2 reactors, we can pull out of building more reactors. So Wynne had put in place some of the pieces to be able to like move toward a renewable future. We thought when he got elected, he might actually be on side with this because he's committed to reducing electricity rates by 12%. And he hasn't done anything that would reduce electricity rates. He canceled some renewable energy contracts. He canceled the conservation programs, which makes absolutely no sense. That's the best way to reduce our electricity costs. So it's
explain that. What would the conservation programs amount to?
There were many billions of dollars in supporting companies to invest, to support industries to retrofit their buildings, or homes to retrofit their building, put in new insulation, changing light bulbs, reducing the demand. Ontario reduced our demand, I think, 16% in the last decade. That's a lot. We always hear energy analysts or the nuclear industry saying, we're going to need so much more electricity as we move into the future. That justifies them building more gas plants or more nuclear plants. Mm-hmm. But in fact, we have been reducing our electricity demand because we're becoming more efficient. All of us. Cars are becoming more efficient. Light bulbs are more efficient. We're building buildings that use way less electricity. So as that demand decreases, and we could ramp that up so much more, which would reduce the need to rebuild Arlington, let's say.
So there was a plan to support and encourage and perhaps give money to projects that would cut back on the use of energy.
Yes,
that has been scuppered.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. How do people get elected if they do something so what sounds like stupid? Who's supporting this? You surely you blame it on the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry doesn't have the votes. Somebody votes for this. So why? What's the argument there?
Well, partly I think, like, for example, the media is very silent on the nuclear front. So the public is unaware. And partly, I think, the reason the nuclear or the media is silent on this issue is because the nuclear industry buys lots of ads. The Power Workers Union has huge, like pre the last election, every week they had huge full page ads. The Power Workers Union and other industries within the nuclear industry just pumping out press releases, how they're creating jobs, etc. So the media is not writing critical pieces about the cost overruns or about the water power from Quebec alternatives or conservation. The media is not publicizing it. The public doesn't know about it. It's not part of the election campaign. So when people are voting, they're not aware of, what we tried to raise the nuclear issue in the last provincial election. And Andrea Horvath of the NDP, they came out and supported our call for the closure of Pickering. Unfortunately, that gave a boost to Doug Ford, because then he jumped in and did a press event at Pickering saying, we're going to keep this plant open and we're going to maintain these jobs, so that it actually harmed the NDP. And then he was sort of committed to moving forward with that agenda. But there's just big money. And
I'm just, if I can interrupt, I want to think in terms of what are the issue or the points that are debated in this thing. It seems one of the issues certainly has to do with the cost. One of the issues ought to, and certainly must, have to do with the safety issue. Certainly this comes and goes. I suppose every time there's a Fukushima, you get concerned again, and otherwise maybe it dies down. And I just wonder what else you can explain this on. And the other argument that I have heard that maybe you can answer has to do with the notion that renewable energy sources are fluctuating, and that you need a stable source of power that you can turn on and off and get your energy out of when the windmill isn't turning or the sun isn't shining. And that's the only argument that I haven't heard refuted, because you just refuted the power, the cost thing, and apparently, the safety issue, although you haven't got to that, but I think we can talk about that too. what about this notion that you need nuclear as a base load kind of thing?
Okay, so some policy analysts debunk that whole theory about baseload. And in fact, renewables are creating baseload by you have to have surplus water. The wind is always blowing somewhere and the sun is always shining somewhere. So they augment each other. That's what the grid is for, is it evens everything out. And so you have surplus power, so that when the wind's not blowing, the sun is shining, and then you augment it with batteries. But the beautiful thing with Ontario is that we are next door to Quebec, which is the 4th largest water power producer in the world. And they have these huge water reservoirs that act like giant batteries. So when we have, let's say we're just pumping out our own wind and solar in Ontario, and suddenly we don't have enough power because the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, Quebec releases the dams, the water at the dams, and that creates the power flow. And when we have lots of wind and solar, they just block up those dams. Mm-hmm. So we're advocating that Ontario also negotiate contracts with Quebec to provide us with a source of storage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, you got me convinced. You might talk a little bit more about this safety issue, though you haven't.
Yes, so we're advocating. Well, so a couple of things. I think I should let Gordon respond specifically to the safety.
Yeah, this is a dialogue, and Gordon has been biding his time till he gets.
But let me just add one thing before I hand the microphone over to Gordon about safety. The Pickering nuclear station, which I mentioned earlier, is right in the middle of the GTA, well beyond its design life. This is one of the world's oldest nuclear stations. It's 6 reactors. The plan is, OPG's plan is to close the station in 2024 and then let it sit idle for 30 years before decommissioning it. And we did some research. International best practice, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency and many countries around the world, are immediately decommissioning those stations after shutdown. They don't have to sit there for 30 years before shutting down. So that was the conventional wisdom 30 years ago or 50 years ago when those stations were built. But today's conventional wisdom is for immediate decommissioning. That means OPG would have to spend the money now instead, or in 2024, instead of sitting on that fund and waiting for 30 years before decommissioning it. But immediate decommissioning would mean we could revitalize the Pickering waterfront 30 years sooner. It would mean creating jobs in 2024 instead of waiting for 30 years. It would be cheaper, and it would be much safer for the citizens of Ontario and the world, really, because we're all downstream of every nuclear station, and for sure the Pickering area, because instead of having that high-level nuclear waste sitting right literally on top of Lake Ontario, we would push the nuclear waste back the farthest away from the lake as possible and put it in attack-resistant, above-ground concrete vaults that are much safer than what they're sitting in right now.
Okay, now I assume, I haven't followed this, but I assume that the argument for waiting is a safety argument, that they think they want to let it cool off a little bit first.
Right, we've completely debunked that. For example, as they rebuild the Darlington reactors, they have to decommission them immediately before rebuilding them. So that's what they did that with the first reactor. They know how to do it. The industry knows how to do that now, and they're doing it at Darlington. So there's no reason to not do it at Pickering and create a much safer space for the citizens of Pickering.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah. Can I hand the baton over to
Yeah,
Gordon?
you don't have to take turns. You can actually disagree with each other or interrupt each other if you do. Do you ever, by the way, disagree on anything? I think you're like-minded as they come.
Sure, but I would never disagree with my elder Gordon.
Okay, Gordon.
There's a lot of disagreements that occur in the anti-nuclear field and everything else. As to one of the most contentious issues is exactly what to do with the nuclear waste, because one of the things that people have difficulty comprehending, and this goes for everybody in our society, even the scientists, and the politicians especially, is just exactly what we have done in the nuclear field in creating huge inventories of newly created radioactive materials that never existed and never were detected on Earth prior to 1939. So it's only been in the last 75 years or so that we have created literally hundreds of new radioactive unstable materials, elements. Now these elements cannot be destroyed by any chemical means. We don't know how to turn off radioactivity. So radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy that keeps on going forever until the atoms have all disintegrated. Now, in some cases, that happens very quickly. These are the ones with so-called short half-lives. And that can happen quite quickly. But there's others that have half-lives of millions of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And as a result, we have created a legacy which far transcends the history of the human race. I mean, human as a species, we've only been on this planet for 2 billion years. Well, that's nothing. For example, the half-life of iodine-129 is 17 million years. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,000 years. Well, that far exceeds the span of any human recorded documents that we have. So the question is, what do we do with this material? And I believe that one of the reasons why we keep on running these reactors is to distract our attention from the real problem that we're creating for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, because we're going to have to look after this stuff. Now, the industry has a natural instinct to want to basically abandon it. They want to do, not in a safe way. They don't want to do it in their intention is not to poison everybody or to kill everybody or to damage the environment. But the fact is they have no real solution at all. All they have is an idea that maybe we can dig a hole somewhere, stick it down in the ground and bury it up and then just walk away from it and pretend it's not there anymore. Well, we know from bitter experience that this just doesn't work. We've had already several failed repositories, 2 of them in Germany. One of them, for example, is called the Assa 2 salt mine. They put radioactive waste down there for many decades, and this is not even the most dangerous stuff. This is just the so-called intermediate level waste. It's lower level. It's not as immediately, well, it won't zap you dead on the spot. You might put it that way. But they are very, very poisonous if they get into the food chain. And they put this stuff down there, and now the government of Germany has declared that this thing is a complete fiasco. It's been leaking radioactive waste out of that mine for the last 20 years. And now they've authorized...
Where does it go?
Well, now they have to take it out of the mine. They have to go down. Oh, it goes into the groundwater, which then percolates into the surface waters and ends up being in the drinking water and ends up being in the food chain. And so it ends up being in the food that you eat. For example, even today in Germany, Metta, there is, and not only in Germany, but also in the Czech Republic and in Austria and in a number of countries, the wild boar, there are hunters that hunt wild boar, and the boar are hundreds of times more radioactive than what you would require for safe human consumption because of radioactivity from the Chernobyl accident.
Yeah, I read that someplace. Wow.
The Chernobyl accident was decades ago, and yet these problems still persist and will continue to persist long into the future. So as these radioactive poisons work their way into the food chain, it affects everybody. It affects the wholesomeness of our food supply, of our drinking water. And now there are naturally occurring radioactive materials, uranium as an example, thorium as an example, radium as an example. We have naturally occurring radioactive materials, but you know what? They're chemically different from the materials that we normally encounter in our food, for example. The trouble with these radioactive materials is they are chemically identical with the ordinary chemicals that we're faced with. For instance, people have heard about radioactive cesium. Well, what they may not realize is that prior to 1939, there was no radioactive cesium anywhere to be found. It was all non-radioactive. Cesium is a natural constituent of the soil. But if you contaminate it with radioactive cesium, once you get the radioactive cesium released with the non-radioactive cesium, you can no longer separate the two. And so what you've done is you've
Because they're chemically identical in most respects, except for the radioactivity.
That's correct. And so what we've done is we have created a new condition on Earth whereby elements, building blocks of matter, which used to be non-radioactive, are now becoming radioactive. And the separation of the radioactive from the non-radioactive is not really possible. That's why, for example, they say correctly that you cannot separate tritium, radioactive tritium, from drinking water. Why is that? Well, because radioactive tritium basically is drinking water. Radioactive tritium is simply the radioactive form of hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. But we don't have very much radioactive hydrogen on planet Earth. The only radioactive hydrogen we have comes from outer space. It's called cosmogenic. It's from cosmic radiation. We get a certain amount, small amount of radioactive tritium. But the CANDU reactors produce huge quantities of radioactive tritium, so much so that the water in the center of Lake Ontario is twice as radioactive as the water in Lake Superior, simply because of the radioactive hydrogen that we've been pumping into it from our CANDU reactors. Mm-hmm. Now, you can't separate the radioactive water molecules from the non-radioactive water molecules because they're chemically identical. The result is it enters into all living things, it enters into our own bodies, it enters into the bodies of developing fetuses, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And that's only the tip of an iceberg, because what has been released is just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what is potentially available to be released. So we have been successful, and the industry is proud of this, and I don't blame them for being proud of it. They have been successful in containing 99.99% of this material.
Of the tritium.
Well, not only tritium, but all the other radioactive products they produce.
Okay.
But once they're abandoned, there's no longer any human intervention. There's no longer any way of containing it. So as a result, our organization, the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, believes that it is irresponsible to abandon this waste, that we have to really keep an eye on it, look after it, and keep it under constant monitoring, make it retrievable, so that future generations know what they're dealing with and can repackage the waste. We do know how to package it. We know how to package it so as to keep it safely out of the environment. But if the packages start leaking or disintegrating, then they have to be repackaged and re-repackaged. And this goes on as long as we don't have a permanent solution. Now, we don't have a permanent solution at the present time, but in the next couple of 100 years, who knows? There could be a solution. In the meantime, we've got to keep our eye on this stuff and make sure that it's packaged very robustly and kept out of the environment and away from military, for example, warfare could disseminate a lot of this material into the environment, and you would have catastrophes. When you see a nuclear accident like the Chernobyl accident, the only thing that's happening there is that the stuff that's inside, the radioactive waste, is getting an opportunity to escape to the outside. When you see the Fukushima accident, the reason the Fukushima reactors melted down was not because of any failure of the mechanism. It was because the radioactivity can't be turned off. And the radioactivity continues to generate heat even after you shut everything down that is possible to shut down. And the result is that you get a temperature of 3,800 degrees Celsius, which is the melting point of uranium, which is already twice the melting point of steel. And everything melts into the ground just because of the radioactivity alone. And even now, for example, they have in Japan a million tons of contaminated radioactive water in huge storage tanks, over 1,000 of them. And they want to
I've heard that recently somebody said it's just inevitably going to have to be put into the ocean.
Well, that was the previous environment minister who was fired the next day.
Keep your mouth shut, fella.
Well, now there's a new environment minister, and this new environment minister is actually the son of an ex-premier of Japan, who is one of 3 premiers who have become totally anti-nuclear. And this particular new environment minister says that Japan should scrap all of its nuclear plants. So this is not the way to go, because all we're doing is we're binding our grandchildren not only to the dangers of the radioactive waste, but to the never-ending expense of looking after it.
Well, hold on now. That's an interesting point. What you're suggesting is that the same government that's in power has somehow flipped without the government itself, without being thrown out and replaced. The government has changed its mind, or is this just one guy?
It's one guy. It's the environment minister. He's saying this, and he is on a collision course with the prime minister, who is Abe, who is quite pro-nuclear, and who has been trying to pretend that there's no problem because he wanted to get the 2020 Olympics for Tokyo. And the 2020 Olympics are going forward. If this million tons of radioactive water were poured into the Pacific Ocean, it means the athletes would be swimming in contaminated water, which they're going to be doing to a certain extent anyway. But what's in those tanks is a whole witch's brew of radioactive materials, dozens and dozens of different radioactive materials, which are going to get into the water, but also into the fish and into the seafood, which is why the fishermen are against it. And South Korea, the South Korean government, is totally against this plan to put it into the Pacific Ocean because they're afraid for the integrity of their own fishery. Now, I mentioned about the wild boars that can't be, when hunters kill a wild boar in any of those countries, Austria, Germany, the Czech Republic, or whatever, they are compensated by the government for the fact that they cannot eat the meat. So there's actually a financial
What's the point?
reward
Oh,
to the hunters.
the government wants them to go out there and kill those guys, but not eat them.
Exactly. And this food is not food, and it can't be fed to any other animals because it's just going to work its way through the food chain. Once the stuff gets into nature's a great recycler, and we humans think that we can fool nature. We think that we can put a sign up saying, Mother Nature, do not recycle this dangerous material. Unfortunately, Mother Nature is not going to pay attention to us. We have to do it ourselves. We have to look after our own waste. Now, and unfortunately here in Canada, they're looking for Native people. They're looking for First Nations lands, places that are adjacent to First Nations land or right on First Nations land, to try and put all of the radioactive waste that we have produced for the sake of people living in cities, consuming all that electricity and saying, well, we don't want the waste, so why don't we send it up to these people who...
Well, where does that stand, by the way? I was hearing a couple of years or three ago about where the search was on for a hiding place, where they're gonna dig and put the stuff. Have they decided, and what's the status of that issue now?
Yeah, that hunt is going on, and by the way, the people who are doing the hunting are precisely the waste producers. It's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is totally owned and operated by the people who produce the nuclear waste. And they're looking for communities, and these communities are generally small communities. The communities that are currently being looked at have only about 1,000 people or less in them, and they get $300,000 a year just for listening to the idea of burying the waste. And they've been getting $300,000 a year for many years. And this is just a way of kind of keeping them on the hook, as you might say. And to a large extent,
it hasn't been decided yet, is that right?
It has not been decided yet. They've narrowed the field down from about 23 candidate sites, some of which were in Saskatchewan. None of them were in Quebec or New Brunswick. And because Quebec passed a unanimous resolution by the National Assembly saying that they would never allow the import of radioactive waste from Ontario plants to be buried in Quebec. Meanwhile, Manitoba actually passed a law which makes it illegal to import radioactive waste into Manitoba for burial. So there were some candidate sites in Saskatchewan, but now those are gone, and there's only 5 sites that they're still looking at. 3 of them are north of Lake Superior. I have visited 2 of them, Manitouage and Hornpain. And the other 2 are right beside Lake Huron, right in the area of the Bruce plants. But the point of the matter, when it really comes down, when push comes to shove, this is in a way a kind of a shell game, because the industry is holding out this false hope that they do have a solution, and they don't. What they have is they have an idea, but that idea is not an idea that you can prove scientifically. In fact, there is no way of demonstrating scientifically that if you put the waste in point A, it's going to stay there. Because nature has all kinds of ways of circulating this stuff. Now, the most important thing about the waste is that it's so active because the ionizing radiation, people may not understand this, but when you have a stable element, a non-radioactive element, it can undergo chemical reactions, of course. But when you have a radioactive element, not only can it undergo chemical reactions, but it can cause other neighboring atoms to undergo chemical reactions by a process called ionization. And this is why, for example, there was an underground repository in Carlsbad, New Mexico, that was completely contaminated with plutonium dust because a barrel exploded.
Sorry, plutonium dust?
Plutonium dust. Plutonium is a man-made, very toxic radioactive material, heavier than uranium. It doesn't exist in nature, but it's created in all nuclear reactors. It's also
every nuclear reactor inevitably produces it, right?
Yes, that's right. In fact, the first reactors that were built precisely for the purpose of producing plutonium for bombs. That was the whole idea. And so at some point they said, well, look, since we're producing plutonium anyway, and since there's all this heat being generated, why don't we boil water and generate electricity as a byproduct? So in fact, when you look at any nuclear reactor, including all the CANDU reactors, the ultimate product is radioactive waste. And it's only a temporary byproduct is the electricity. So the electricity is there for maybe a couple of decades if you're lucky, whereas the waste will be there forever. And the plutonium will be there for thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to come. That's really what these reactors are producing.
Mm-hmm.
You get a little blip of a few decades of electricity, and after that, you've got radioactive waste forever.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you talk about any particular new innovation as being significantly safer than any of the others? It sounds like if all of them are going to produce plutonium, well, right from the get-go, you know that right now, to my mind, is not a safe thing to do. But can you, we have offers of a competition, in fact, to innovate with these small modular reactors. And tell me about that in terms of safety.
Well, small modular reactors, first of all, they're not small. Some of them are quite large. For example, we have reactors here in Quebec. We've got the Gentil 1 reactor, which is only 250 megawatts.
But they turned one of those off, right?
They're both shut down completely. In fact, the Gentil 1 reactor is owned by the federal government, whereas the Gentil 2 reactor is owned by the provincial government. But they both produce high-level radioactive waste. They both produce irradiated nuclear fuel, which will be dangerous for millions of years. And they both produce plutonium in quite lavish amounts. Now, but these small modular reactors, don't be fooled by the small word. They're not that small. And they produce the same kind, exactly the same kind of high-level radioactive waste, low-level radioactive waste, medium-level radioactive waste that any other reactor produces. There's no fundamental difference in the kind of waste it produces, except that the irradiated fuel will be, in fact, more radioactive when it's removed from the reactor than the fuel that we now deal with. The reason for that is because the fuel will be much more enriched. Enriched just means it has much more energy per gram, and consequently you get many more fission products per gram, which are the radioactive byproducts, and consequently you get far more radioactivity in this fuel than you do in the fuel we have today. We don't use enriched fuel in Canada generally in our reactors. So these small modular reactors are like, but they want to sell these by the hundreds because that's the only way they can make them profitable. The reason for that is because when you make a reactor smaller, it becomes more expensive per unit of energy. In fact, the reason they built the big reactors in the first place was for what they call economies of scale. In other words, by making it large, you can benefit from the size to overcome some of the cost disadvantages. But when you make it small, it inherently becomes more expensive. And that's where the word modular comes in. Modular is the idea that, well, if it's small, it's going to cost more, but if we could mass produce them, if we could have an assembly line that churns them out the way we churn out refrigerators or the way we churn out computers, and just turn them out by the hundreds or thousands, then we might be able to make up the difference and be able to make it cheaper again, be able to make a profit again. So these things are not profitable as individual plants. But
The idea is some sort of assembly line, practically.
that's correct. That's what the word modular implies. The word modular implies that you have a factory somewhere in the United States or somewhere else, not in Canada for the most part, although it could be in Canada, that mass produces components, modular components for these reactors, which would then be shipped to various places in the far north or in other countries, in remote regions and isolated communities all over the world, where they could then be assembled and run as nuclear reactors. And the modularization of the manufacture would allow them to become eventually profitable. But this is a crazy idea because it implies that you would have to sell hundreds or thousands of these things to break even. Just the other day, there was a front page story in the Telegraph Journal of St. John, New Brunswick, saying that they would want to build a plant in New Brunswick to produce modules for a small modular reactor that's never yet been built, tested, or deployed or licensed. And they would have to produce about 800 of these things in order to make it profitable. 800. Where are you going to put 800 nuclear reactors? You want one?
What kind of demand could, at the optimum level, or their preferred level, what kind of sales could they look forward to? 800 sounds like a lot. I mean, how many reactors are there in the world? 500 or something, aren't there?
There's only about 400. There's between 400 and 500 at the present time. That's right.
So you're not going to have 800 more.
Well, they would
at the same time that you have renewables energy going up everywhere, right?
Well, that's exactly right. As a matter of fact, the share of nuclear worldwide in terms of electricity supply has plummeted from 17% back at the end of the previous century to about less than 10% today. So the role of nuclear is very sharply on the decline. And the age of large nuclear reactors, certainly in North America and in Western Europe, is pretty well over. There's a couple of large reactors under construction, but those large reactors that are under construction have driven companies into bankruptcy because of the cost overruns. So Riva, for example, in France, which has been bailed out by the French government, Westinghouse in the United States went bankrupt because of the plants they're building down there. They're now hoping that because they failed to sell large reactors, they're fighting for their life. The nuclear industry is fighting for its life. And what they think is that if the large nuclear renaissance didn't work, which it didn't, they launched something called the nuclear renaissance back around the year 2000. You might remember, Metta. They were saying,
but I don't think it amounted to much, did it?
No, it's a total fiasco. It was a total flop. And so now they're taking a second kick at the can. They're saying, well, we couldn't sell the large reactors without going bankrupt. So let's try and get the governments to support us in promoting these small reactors. And it's only government money that will pay for the initial phase of this. And that's why they're tapping into the federal government treasury. They're tapping into the treasury of New Brunswick. In the United States, they're tapping into the US Treasury in order to try and get this new pipe dream underway. And here's the catch. There are, believe it or not, it's hard to believe this, but there are more than 150 different varieties of designs of small modular reactors.
Really?
Yes. Everybody, they had a report for Ontario, for example, commissioned by the Ontario government, where they only looked at 90 different designs, and they chose out of those 90 designs, they chose 7 that they thought were maybe the most promising. But when you have 150 different designs, and you have right now in New Brunswick, they're talking about building 2 completely different designs of modular reactors. At Chalk River in Ontario, they want to build a 3rd design, not at all in common with the 2 that are being built in New Brunswick. And they want to build 6 or 7 of different designs at Chalk River. Here's the question. If you're going to have 150 different designs and you're going to be promoting quite a few of them, what are the chances that any one design is going to corner the market enough to make a profit? Because in order to be profitable, they would have to have a virtual monopoly. They'd have to be able to sell hundreds of one design. If you have like 100 designs and you're only producing a couple of each, it's never going to be profitable. So what you're seeing here really is an order book which is full of blank pages. If you look at their order book, and who has actually ordered these things? Nobody. There's nobody.
Okay, but look overseas. My understanding is that there's no business future for so far for nuclear things very much in North America, maybe in
Right.
Europe, but that there are other countries in, poorer countries, developing countries, where they are putting them in. Now, what is the rationale for doing it there, and why? And if that's true, why is it happening there and not here?
Well, it's happening. There's a certain degree of expansion, but it's cut back a great deal than over what it was before. There's a certain degree of expansion and new building going on in Russia, in India, in China, and in a few other countries, mostly in Asia, and also in Eastern Europe. There's been some interest, and in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, for example, is trying to clinch a deal with Jared Kushner to get not only a nuclear reactor, but to get all the necessary factories that would allow them to have an easy access to the technology needed to produce nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And Jared Kushner is willing to sell them that, it seems. And there's a great deal of alarm in the non-proliferation field over what is being done with Saudi Arabia, because, of course, as you know, Saudi Arabia regards Iran as its mortal enemy. And the fact that Iran has been accused of trying to develop an atomic bomb, rightly or wrongly, this gives an incentive to Saudi Arabia. That's one of the big problems with nuclear power, is that many of the regimes that are wanting to acquire nuclear capabilities are really interested in the weapons byproduct, because, of course, the reactor produces the plutonium, and the plutonium is a primary nuclear explosive. And if you can get the material out of the spent fuel, which is called reprocessing, which Jared Kushner wants to sell to Saudi Arabians, then you have not only an energy source for electricity, but you also have access to the materials needed for nuclear weapons. So we have a lot of problems here associated with nuclear power, and these problems they're not going to go away. They're just going to get worse as we spread these things far and wide. If we start selling small modular reactors all over the planet, each one of those places is going to turn into a nuclear waste dump, every single one of them. And because these reactors are normally built right beside rivers and lakes for cooling water, that means that the water system is very vulnerable to contamination. Because even if they take the irradiated fuel out of these small reactors when they're finished, many people do not realize that the reactor structure itself becomes intensely radioactive. Yeah. For example, Angela was mentioning earlier in the discussion today that when the workers go in to do the refurbishment of the reactors, they have to have protection. Why do they have to have protection? Because haven't they taken the irradiated fuel out of the reactor? Yes, of course they have. But the internal of the reactor itself becomes so radioactive that you need to have lead cages for the workers to work in, because there's intense gamma radiation being given off, as well as contamination. We've had hundreds of workers who have been breathing plutonium dust during these refurbishment operations, and they will carry that plutonium in their lungs for the rest of their lives. Over 500 workers. Even at Darlington, we're having workers who are being contaminated with plutonium. There's also workers who, in Pickering, who did some retubing years ago at Pickering. They were contaminated with what's called carbon-14 dust. And they carried this stuff into their homes because it wasn't detected for many, many weeks. And the result is Ontario Power Generation, which was then known as Ontario Hydro, they had to go into those homes and confiscate furniture and bedclothes and clothing and bury it as radioactive waste because the workers had tracked it into their homes. That's the problem with this stuff, is that although you do have potential ability to package it and contain it, somebody's got to be looking after it all the time. You can't afford to go to sleep on the job.
Mm-hmm. And we're trying to create a situation that's going to last forever as we do that.
That's it. If we only had a switch so we could turn off radioactivity, then we could say,
well, is there any conceivable way of doing that? I mean, is there nobody? I've heard somebody say, well, what we should do is somehow get it down into the center of the earth. If we're going to get it into the magma in this center in the the core of the earth, that would be a good disposal.
That sounds a good idea. I think if we tapped into the center of the earth, we could create our own volcano. Why not? But what would be better than the center of the earth would be the center of the sun. If we had Captain Kirk if he was still with us, he's from Montreal, of course, you know, William Shatner. So
No, I didn't know.
But if we just called on William Shatner, he could just put the radioactive waste into a transporter booth and beam it into the sun, and that would get rid of it. That would get rid of it. But
Well, I heard one guy one time who was a radiologist saying that that would be the safest way of trying to get rid of the stuff is shoot it off into space or into the sun. But, you know, suppose you just have a missile failure on the way.
People are generally unfamiliar with the number of rockets that have exploded in midair or on the launching pad. There has been a tremendous number of rockets that have exploded. And if this rocket was carrying nuclear waste, which, by the way, you know, we're talking about here in Canada, for example, 50,000 tons. This is not the kind, you know, they're trying to design ultralight things that they can put into space so that the rocket can carry it. 50,000 tons of radioactive waste requires a hell of a lot of rockets. And how many of those rockets are likely to explode or disintegrate in midair? Because a lot of them have. And that would just spread the stuff all over Hell's Half Acre.
Yeah, let me ask you one final thing about something like Generation 3 or something. When I hear people talking about the future that is so bright for nuclear power, it is that some upcoming generations of design are going to be so much better. Can you quickly explain what that means? I don't know anything.
Well, the fundamental problem remains the same no matter what you do. And nuclear fission automatically creates hundreds of radioactive byproducts from various mechanisms. There's one mechanism called the splitting of the atom, which creates what are called the fission products. These are all the smaller radioactive materials like cesium-137, strontium-90, iodine-131, krypton-85. There's hundreds of them. Then there's the transuranic elements. These are the elements that are heavier than uranium. Some of the uranium atoms do not split, but rather they absorb neutrons and become heavier. And this turns into plutonium and neptunium and curium and americium, and they're called the transuranic actinides. They tend to be very, very long-lived, and they tend to be about many thousands of times more toxic than the fission products as a poison, as an internal poison. Oftentimes these materials are not so hazardous outside the body, but inside the body they can be. For example, plutonium, a simple mathematical calculation will show you that one disintegration of a plutonium atom is approximately 18,000 times more biologically damaging than a disintegration of a tritium atom. So even though they both disintegrate and they both have radioactive emissions, the emissions from plutonium are extraordinarily damaging to biological systems. That's why it's considered one of the most toxic materials ever produced by mankind. But these things, there's also activation products. Now, activation products are, for example, let's take steel, concrete, or even water, or even air. These things, which are non-radioactive, just by being in the center of the reactor, they become radioactive, not by contamination, but by activation. It means that the neutrons, for example, will strike steel, and the steel has a little bit of cobalt-59, which is a non-radioactive element in the steel. That turns into cobalt-60, which is radioactive. That's called activation. Where non-radioactive, and that's where the tritium comes from. In fact, most of the tritium comes from non-radioactive water, which is in the reactor, and it becomes radioactive by absorbing neutrons. And that's why we have so much tritium released from CANDU reactors. The tritium is not produced inside the fuel. The tritium is produced inside the heavy water, and the heavy water is not radioactive, but it becomes very radioactive because of the
let me back up because I didn't get everything that you said about this. Is it Generation 3, Generation 4?
Generation 4.
Yeah, what's the difference? Is it that they are producing this heavier?
I'll tell you what it is. When they first started looking at nuclear power back in the 1940s, and they had a secret laboratory here in Montreal on the slopes of Mount Royal, where they developed the best methods for producing plutonium for bombs, which is what Chalk River was built for. Chalk River was built, the building of Chalk River was authorized in 1944 in Washington, D.C., and the purpose was to use Canadian technology to produce plutonium for bombs, and we did sell them plutonium for bombs for 20 years after the war. and they did use it for that purpose. Now, while they were looking at this, they said that we're going to run out of uranium at a certain point. The uranium supply is not going to outlast the oil supply, really. If nuclear power were to be truly successful, which it has not been so far, if it were to have tens of thousands of reactors operating around the world, we would very quickly run out of uranium, just like we're going to run out of oil. And so we'd have to start using plutonium as a fuel. So these advanced reactor systems, like Generation 3, Generation 4, are tending in the direction of using plutonium as a supplement to uranium as a fuel. The danger with that, the main danger with that, is that if you start creating a civilian economy that handles plutonium, you cannot keep that plutonium out of the hands of criminals, because criminals get their hand on anything that's commercially traded. Whether it's heroin, whether it's drugs, whether it's money, whether it's whatever it is, they're going to get their hands on some of it. And if you get your hands on plutonium, you can make your own atomic bombs. So consequently, this is a horrendous possibility, and it's the main reason fundamentally for opposing these so-called advanced reactor concepts. In 1978, the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning published a report called A Race Against Time about nuclear energy in Ontario. And one of their recommendations was that there should be no centralized storage of irradiated nuclear fuel, because if it's stored centrally, it's going to be so expensive to do that it'll be very tempting to get the plutonium out of the fuel before burying the waste. And if you get the plutonium out of the fuel, that's called advanced fuel cycles. They said, we do not believe that that's a good way to move in. Society should stop and think very carefully before embarking on what's called a plutonium economy, because you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once you start getting plutonium in circulation, wide circulation, look out. You're going to have a world in which anybody could produce atomic bombs without anybody's knowledge. In other words, what one person said is, you could wake up and find Washington, D.C. gone and not have the faintest idea who did it.
So it's clear that Angela and you need to have a place on our website where we ask people to become aware of what you're doing and to participate if you have a project going on.
A good deal of this information is on our website, which is www.ccnr, Charles Norman Robert, ccnr.org.
Great. And Angela, why don't you say your website too, and then we'll hang up.
cleanairalliance.org.
Bless you. Thank you both. I appreciate it, and carry on.
Thanks, Metta and Gordon.
Bye.
Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.